Thank you for listening to the Drinks.com podcast, The Business of Online Alcohol. I'm your host, Brandon Amoroso, and today I'm talking with Michael Cella, Managing Director, Group Head of U.S. Consumer Investment Banking at Oppenheimer & Co. Thanks for coming on.
Great to be here. Thanks, Brandon.
So before we jump into some of the topics we want to cover today, can you give everybody just a quick background on yourself?
Yeah, for sure. So again, great to be here. I'm a managing director and I run the consumer investment banking group at Oppenheimer. I've been here for about a year. Overall, 20 years investment banking experience. Spent most of my time working in the fund subsectors of alcohol and cannabis. And so as it relates to alcohol, wine is one of the areas that I specialize in as well. So based in San Francisco, wine is an industry that I care a lot about and have some family history in as well.
What's your family history in the wine?
Yeah, so my grandparents were in the wine business, actually sold wine during Prohibition to the Catholic Church. Moved from New York to California, started in the Central Valley, and eventually sold their business and moved up to Northern California. I also have a sister who's a winemaker in South Africa, so we've kept that tradition going.
Nice. I had no idea. That's really cool, and makes this even more relevant for our talk today. So, pulling back from that, given that you're obviously on the investment side, what does the macroeconomic environment look like for wineries and just the alcohol industry as a whole in 2024? And how does it differ from, the COVID period and even before that?
Well, I'll start by saying if you're reading the headlines, there's a lot of negativity on the industry. But maybe I'll take a contrarian view and look longer term. I don't think alcohol is going anywhere. I think the headlines for wine in general have been California wine industry is hurting. There's some view of pain for specific operators in the industry today. But it's still a product that a lot of people consume all the time. If you compare it to the COVID times, I think everyone was pantry loading and buying alcohol and consuming it on a pretty regular basis. I think we're now getting back to a new normal, which is the kind of pre-COVID time, and so we've seen some pullback in terms of consumption. I do think that there are some interesting trends as it relates to alcohol, where non-alc options are growing, and I think that that's an interesting dynamic. But I still think that alcohol broadly and wine specifically are going to be consumed, quite regularly over time. I will say the way that consumers are consuming is changing a little bit too. During COVID, online, that's where you did your shopping. That took a lot of share from the traditional brick and mortar operators, but we've had some more return to normalcy in the last couple years where online hasn't grown as fast. But I think if you think about yourself, and I'll speak for myself too, I generally trend towards buying online these days, and I think that that's only going to continue over time as well.
Yeah, I think the time and convenience factor, especially as cities are getting more and more populous, it's getting more and more difficult to even just get around and commute. The thought for me of going to a brick and mortar store it's almost impossible. Like, I don't even know when I would do it during the day, because I basically have to block like a full hour and a half chunk to be able to get in the car, drive there, find parking, get into the store, go through the selection process, which is more difficult, I would argue, in store than it is online, because you don't have access to all this information at your fingertips. And then you got to make the whole return trip back too. And if you're in Miami, the bridge will probably go up because there's a boat passing through. So then you'll sit there for another 25 minutes. But there's the convenience that people are getting familiar with, especially with Amazon. I mean, I can literally order something, tonight, and it'll be at my doorstep at 7 a.m. Why would I ever, leave the house to go out and get something like that? So I think long term, it's definitely going to continue in that direction. But there were some, I think, overreactions in COVID. From your perspective, what were some of the mistakes that were made during the COVID sort of boom when it comes to online alcohol? And maybe not mistakes because, there's a lot going on at that time and nobody really knew what was going on. But looking
Yeah.
back, and obviously hindsight's 2020, what were some of the missteps that have led to this being worse than it would have been otherwise? Because obviously a lot of industries are cyclical, and still there might have been a downturn here, even if it wasn't for COVID. But what were some of the things that happened during that time period that have made it a little bit more harsh in 2024?
Yeah, I think that there are two key aspects. One is expecting that revenue growth would continue indefinitely. I think businesses are right to prepare for upside. And if you look back the last 20, 30 years in wine, consumption has been, pretty consistent in going up and to the right. Um, and preparing for the chance that it wouldn't do that, I think would have been a good thing to do. The other is the cost dynamics, and we see inflation continues to be challenging, and building in costs going up. I don't think every company did that. I think that there was some hope that um, that on the cost side things could stay flat or efficiencies could be gained, and so ultimate margin expectations I think were probably too high for some. So I would say both on the revenue and on the margin side, being prepared for what is now proving out to be a more challenging time. Yeah, I think that could have been something that, with hindsight, kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of companies that are sitting on quite a bit of inventory right now. It feels like, as but not just in the alcohol vertical either. I see it across the board where there was a mad dash to order during that COVID boom, and then because of the supply chain issues, a lot of the product didn't get there until the demand was already starting to subside because regulations were getting lifted, and now there's quite a few companies with too much stock on their hands, and they're trying to figure out ways to to get through that.
Yeah, and with wine in particular, you know, you generally want to sell the most current vintage that's available, whether it's a red or a white. And so having too much of a stockpile for prior vintages, it's going to be costly to move through that.
When you're speaking with wineries and alcohol companies at large, what are some of the things that they're thinking about or that they're focused on moving through this period?
I think it's being careful, making sure that the companies have the financing they need to be able to operate, have a bigger cushion and bigger financial flexibility. That said, and we see this not just in wine, but I think you're going to continue to see the haves and the have-nots, where some companies are doing just fine. And so I think where there's strength in the industry, those companies can continue to grow. And in some cases, they may take advantage of other companies that are having a harder time. But look, in terms of valuations, we're not seeing fire sale prices at this stage. I suppose it could come to that, but even if you just look at the headlines, you'd think things are tough. Valuations are holding up decently well, and I think that that's a testament to the strength of the industry and the overall long-term approach um, that some of these stronger operators in the industry are taking.
I think the thing that's pretty unique about at least the wineries and some of the public coverage I've seen is that in the case of most of the Shopify brands we work with, they're totally digitally native. They have no retail presence. They don't have any land. They don't really have any assets. It's just the products that they're trying to sell through. Whereas most of the wineries out there, they own the land that they produce on. They have the physical, tasting room where they're selling out of. So they do have other things aside from that online sales channel. And I think you see it with sort of the D2C brands that only have D2C. They've been impacted the most whereas the ones that do have those other channels that they've already been selling through, they're seeing more and more traction through those.
Yeah, and I take Napa or Sonoma as an example. We're seeing consumer trends continue to be strong with, well, what I'll call experiential retail. People are still traveling. People want to visit, and so to your point, I think having a tasting room, people that are going to wine country here in California, and things are I think things are challenged, but there's still reason for optimism as the consumer wants to travel and have those sorts of experiences.
Actually, on another podcast unrelated to alcohol that I recorded literally just this past Friday, all we talked about was experience retail and how as the younger generations are getting older and older, they value experiences significantly more than generations previous to them. And that's starting to reflect itself in the way that they purchase, but also in the way that brands and retailers are trying to market and create these experiences around the products they sell. Because it's not enough to go off of hype alone or to have a product that you're able to market effectively online. Where I think the stats were something like where Gen Z and younger is really frugal, like rather tight with where they spend, except when it comes to things like experiences. And a lot of that has to do with the social component of it, because when you go to that experience, it's almost like social signaling or status signaling because you're posting about it on Instagram, you're showing it to your friends. It's more like an experience-based economy than it is hyper consumerism, trying to buy labels and things of that nature that was sort of the way older generations shop previous to that. So I think it'll be curious to see how wineries and alcohol companies try to tap more into that. Because from my perspective, you have alternative products or alternative product formats that have been entering the market that are doing a better job of that. Whether the branding perceives more to the younger generation or they're more focused on experiential pop-ups and things like that. There's companies like Nomadica or Bev or a lot of these other sort of startup wine companies. I mean Gary Vee had his that I think sold to CBI, and they are I think pushing the industry forward faster than it would be moving otherwise because of the way that they're able to tap into that younger audience through some of the things that they do in that front.
Yeah, that's an interesting dynamic, and wine, I think in particular, is such a heritage-driven industry historically, and I think it's been slower to move and adapt than perhaps some other industries. But to your point, there are new brands that are exciting that are speaking to the next generation consumer, and generational change in wine, I think, is a really important dynamic that's going on right now, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah, and you have the low alc and no alc folks that are starting to take more market share. I think Athletic Brewing is a fascinating company that continues to seem growing and doing really well, though I don't know if they actually are, but it feels like that category is taking up a lot of steam. And I've also heard from some wineries that they're worried about cannabis as well because that is being viewed as an alternative for some, especially as cannabis moves into other consumption methods. It's not just smoking it. You can take tinctures, there's drinks, there's literally 1,000 different ways that you can consume it now. And it actually is typically cheaper, like on a price per, I forget what the term is, but if you're looking at even like a canned beverage, it's typically cheaper, the cannabis alternative to like wine in a can. Um, have you been hearing that at all in terms of a shifting in consumer trends towards that as an alternative versus alcohol?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's no hangover, generally no calories for cannabis. And to your point, the amount of buzz that you can get per dollar spent it's a pretty good it's a pretty good deal, if that's what you're looking for in terms of consumption. So yeah, I think that those are all real dynamics that are occurring. What I would say is Cannabis in the United States, it remains federally illegal. There's been a lot of talk about change and opportunity for that to change in the future. But the reality is, it's already an industry that exists. It's a $50 billion industry, and the way that people are consuming cannabis is going to change. And I think the regulatory environment is going to change over time. Um, and if you look at generationally, the number of consumers that have tried cannabis of younger generations, you might see more of a preference shift for them to wine. But wine has historically been something that can be aspirational, and so as younger generations, advance their careers in the workforce and build their wealth, I think that there is an aspirational aspect to wine that maybe doesn't exist in the same way for cannabis. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's some initial pullback in consumption for younger generations in wine, except for maybe the brands that are really speaking to them, like the brands that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I don't really know why, but it feels like cannabis has sort of been turned a little bit into a commodity where it's very difficult to have that brand differentiation. I mean, that's an industry that has been hit really hard over the past 2, 3 years, where it feels like companies are just going out of business left and right. I mean, there's obviously a few winners, but the market is saturated with supply. But for some reason, there's still that aspirational aspect to wine that I haven't seen in cannabis, where there's that sort of legacy and history, and especially at the higher end, above a certain price point. I think that'll continue to persist, and as long as they're able to maintain that, not only the quality itself, but the perception of quality and value, I don't see them really going anywhere. And I think that subset of the market hasn't really been impacted that much throughout any of this, because those are relatively consistent consumers.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point. There's not a national brand, or there aren't really national brands in cannabis yet that have the same sort of share that other product categories outside of cannabis have. Part of that, again, is the regulatory environment, where every state has a say as to what they want their cannabis market to look like. So, there are a few examples of brands that have, pretty good US coverage. But what you see a lot of is individual states with brands that don't necessarily travel outside that state yet. And so, alcohol has the benefit of national branding in a way that cannabis doesn't. And so, you're not wrong in terms of wholesale flower prices in cannabis. Those have faced some pretty significant downward pressure. And then, moving away from the concept of, is this a commodity, is going to be important if those companies are going to build a brand over time.
Yeah, the brand differentiation, I think, leads itself into the experience component that we were talking about earlier. Because the brands that really can build out that differentiation, it's all based off of their customer base, and whether or not the customer base is able to connect and relate to the brand. And one of the best ways to do that is through the experiences, which sure, there is that component in cannabis, but it is definitely not as prolific as the concept of going on a winery tour or going for a wine tasting. Maybe that'll change in 50 years, but I don't think anytime soon.
Yeah, I think it's going to take time. The concept of going to a bar, uh, enjoying alcohol at a meal, doing a wine tasting, those are all very natural things. There hasn't really been built an equivalent in cannabis at this stage. And I think to your point, it may take decades to get there.
Given the current climate, would you say now is a good or a bad time to start an alcohol business?
Yeah, maybe I'm a contrarian, and I think of the Warren Buffett quote, be greedy when people are fearful, and be fearful when people are greedy. I think we're in that market where people are fearful right now. I think some of the M&A activity that happens in this market is going to be really lucrative for those buyers because they're able to buy a business at a fair price, rather than maybe at a premium price when things are better. In terms of starting a business, I think that there will be great businesses started right now. And I think in part because there are folks that are pulling back and reading the headlines. So yeah, I'll be an optimist right now when people are pessimists and say now is a good time.
Yeah, I think I read an article somewhere, and it wasn't related to alcohol specifically, but some of the best businesses and some of even the ones that we all interact with today were started during, downtimes or recessions, and it's almost can be viewed as an opportunity, especially I think coming off of the heels of a big boom where a lot of the existing players are maybe reeling from some of the missteps that they took during that uptick. You could really, be well positioned, both from a cash standpoint, but also just a market opportunity standpoint to be able to take up some share. But I feel like now would be a great time to have a lot of money to take advantage of some of these opportunities.
Yeah, and I think you're going to see some parties do that. There are some recent acquisitions by Constellation and Gallo. These are some of the largest uh, wine businesses out there, and they're taking advantage of uh, what's available in the market.
And alcohol is not going anywhere, at least not anytime soon. So um, it will always come back. I've got a couple of fun questions for you,
All right.
stepping back from the nitty gritty of the finance world. But first, what is your favorite wine memory, or it could be alcohol memory?
Yeah, great question. Um, I'd say wine tasting in Napa. I did a tasting at Opus One for an anniversary recently, and it was fantastic. And it reminds me what's so great about Napa. Um, I've probably done, I don't know, over 100 wine tastings in my life, and it doesn't get old. And so I think the recent one that I'm thinking of is one that is a great memory. But I think what makes it great too is it's a reminder of all the other great memories of wine tasting um, in wine country in California.
I think that's one of the unique things about wine and alcohol in general is that there's typically, a setting, an environment, a person or a group of people that you're with when you're enjoying it, and that lends itself to, more than just being a product because there's memories associated with it. You don't remember necessarily the best bottle you've ever had. You remember the bottle because of who you were with, where you were, what you were doing, and all the other components that go into it.
Absolutely.
Last one, if you could share a bottle with anyone, who would it be and what would you drink?
Good question. Um, I mean, I feel like I made the wife comment earlier, so that's the obvious answer as I was referencing my anniversary. But I'll maybe I'll use a more aspirational idea in the future. Um, I think it would be really fun. I have a poster of my grandfather being in one of the early Italians in the California wine industry, and it's with all the names that you still recognize today. I think it would be really cool to do a tasting with kind of the next generation winemakers, a bigger event, and be a part of what's going to be the next 100 years of wine. In terms of bottle or type of wine. Um, Maybe I'll give a crazy answer rather than focus on the cult wines. I do think that technology has an opportunity to impact wine in the future, and so maybe something that UC Davis is doing around creating flavor profiles for wine that can match what nature can do. I think that would be fun. So I'm going to take a futuristic approach, and maybe a wine that doesn't quite exist yet that could be made in the likes of I don't know, a Screaming Eagle or a Colgan, but maybe is done with more technology.
That is an interesting point that you bring up. You know, if at a certain point you can basically just engineer wine to taste exactly like the really high end stuff, is there a point where that has some sort of impact on them, or is it similar to like having an original painting versus having copies of it? I think that'll be an interesting next 50 years.
Yeah, and I think that there's always going to be a place for the real thing. Um, Having a copy or something that's modified, I think will be really interesting. But take plant-based meat. People are still eating steaks, and people are still eating high-end steaks, even though that there are options that are interesting alternatives to that. So
Yeah, agreed. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Before we hop off here, if anyone wants to connect with you, where's the best place to find you online?
yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. So Michael Cella is my name. Feel free to connect, and look forward to talking about alcohol, wine, or anything else that touches on the consumer. So appreciate the plug. Thanks, Brandon.
Awesome. Thanks for joining. As always, for everybody listening, this is Brandon Amoroso, and you can find us at drinks.com. We will see you next time.